but everything's so much quicker with the new antenna.
Oh.
Is it?
Yeah, I noticed immediately as soon as I was setting it up. It's really super.
Wow.
Thank you.
Perhaps it's more like just like a reliability thing generally.
It was just much quicker. Much quicker. On speaking, yeah, Gabby. Mic.
Yes, it is.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Classical Concerts from Quarantine, episode 13. Unlucky for some, I guess. Certainly my hay fever is blighting me like not before this year. But I can normally bank on the adrenaline of playing for you all to banish such things. So let's hope that that comes through. Yeah, it feels kind of, I don't know, a bit of a draining week. The weather's not that nice, but quite hot and humid and oppressive. We met up with some friends for the first time in months yesterday, or at least the first time we'd seen those friends in months. It was largely a lovely experience, but it was also way more overwhelming than I had bargained for. And I guess it really shone a light on just how used to our new normals we've become. I suppose we all know from our lives how few repetitions it takes to develop new habits, and 3 months is a long time. So yeah, I came away feeling, I think, just overwhelmingly grateful for the people that I live with, because that's given me a lease of life that I hadn't quite appreciated until talking to people who haven't had that for the last 3 months. And I guess I'm comforted as well by knowing that just as we may have developed these habits which now make it uncomfortable and strange to be surrounded by our friends again, we can unlearn those habits and we can form new habits. Hopefully, as things continue to ease, we can rebuild the love and closeness and ease of intimacy that we had with our loved ones before. Coincidentally, I think today's program is probably the most lovely of all of the ones so far, which I think is great, because I feel like some balm is exactly what I need right now. We're going to start and end with some French music, a couple of little works, one not that well known, one incredibly famous, both from the beginning of the lives of their composers. And in the middle of the concert we're going to have one of Mozart's best loved sonatas, which is a wondrous work in many ways, also unusual in many ways, and I'll enjoy talking to you about some of those. So first we're going to hear a Romance sans Paroles, a romance without words. This is the third one that Fauré wrote in his Opus 17, and it's goes right back to when he was a student studying with Saint-Saëns. And Saint-Saëns was clearly quite a progressive looking guy, because he was introducing Fauré to the music of Liszt and Wagner and really opening his horizons. And of course, any of us who know the later works of Fauré know just how exploratory and far-reaching his musical language was to become. This is a little simple ditty, and a French answer, if you like, to these songs without words invented by Mendelssohn. This kind of style had become very vogue as music moved out of the classical era, and compositions with dry titles such as sonata were not quite cutting it anymore in terms of the necessity and want for people to bear their emotional romantic sensibilities. Songs without words almost entirely were written for piano, and it's the idea of a song without words. One must intuit oneself what's going on in the narrative. Beautiful little work. Hope you enjoy it. go. A little easing, soothing into events today. I'm looking at Gabby lying fully out on the floor on her back, and not for the first time in my life thinking that is the way to listen to classical music. Me and our housemate Andy have little pipe fantasy dreams of almost certainly never to materialise futures. Andy's is to run a coffee shop, come wine bar, come bookshop, and my piggybacked idea would be to have a little almost pop-up concert hall attached to that, and were I ever to design my own concert space, there would be no such thing as formal hardback chairs. I think soft furnishings and floor space would reign supreme. That was a request by some dear friends of ours who've also requested the third piece today, so I'll mention them later, but he described that Fauré piece as just pure and simple joy, and yeah, it's lovely listening to music that seems so uncomplicated and easy, especially when we think of all the journeys we've been over in the last 3 months, and the anguish, the pain, the torture that music can conjure up. I think the theme of today is going to be a certain kind of ease and facility of expression. Mozart wrote about 20 piano sonatas, and you could argue they fall into 3 general periods. The early ones are sort of the least developed, and then there's a sort of middle period where he's experimenting and feeling things out, and then there's a later, very developed period. This one comes from his middle period. There's some debate as to exactly when it was written. Well, there's a lot of debate as to exactly when it was written, but even the year we think is 1783, although it may have been earlier. He just returned to Vienna for his second stint that was to become the peak period of his professional and musical life. And yes, this music is genial, is gentle. It doesn't force you to bend to its will. It leads you by the hand, puts its arm round your shoulder. It's very comforting in that way. A couple of unusual things about this sonata. Not one of the movements, it's in 3 movements, not one of them follows traditional, as one would expect, sonata form. And this was the first and only time for Mozart in his sonatas that not one of the movements adhered to that structure. So what we have for the first movement is the theme and variations. This is not the first time we've come across this. We approached the Haydn theme and variations a long time ago now. This is where a composer writes a theme, normally fairly simple, for the reason that it is to be embellished and decorated subsequently. In this case, he writes a theme and then treats it to 6 variations. And the theme is, I won't say, well, I think in lots of Mozart music, the music is so simple as to sometimes seem banal. It's not, but it's almost disarmingly foursquare. And maybe that's why it pleases us so much. I think there's one area where the classical era of music really does tie in with architecture, and that's its sense of symmetry and proportion. And the way he constructs these phrases are so balanced, are so even, that it just gives us, I think, an incredible amount of pleasure just from that alone, regardless of the melodies and the harmonies. And actually the harmonies are very, very simple too. So the theme is made up of 4 lines of music, and each of them divided into, well, each phrase divided into 4 bars. And you could even argue that each 4 bars is divided into 2 balanced 2 bars. So the symmetry and the proportion just balances and stacks up more and more. And then you look at the fact that the first and the second bars are the same rhythmic figure, followed by... So that gives us a little internal journey and feeling of connection all on its own. And then the next two bars take us on a slightly longer narrative, and they belong as one overarching phrase rather than two little blobs. And so put together, we've got a 4-bar chunk made up of 1 + 1, which are kind of relatives because they're the same rhythm, and then a 2-bar phrase. And so overall, we get a lovely rule of 3 that's so often used in music. So we try once, and then twice, and then the third time, we really express what we had to say. Third time always longer than the first and the second. He follows that exact same pattern for the second line. And then uses the last 2 bars not to ask a question, but to bring us back to the home key. The third line departs completely and takes us on a much more far-reaching harmonic journey. For the fourth and last line, he brings us home again to the opening material. And just when we think he's going to bring us home, he doesn't, and throws in a tagged on extra 2 bars. Which brings us home with a little bit more of a flourish. I wanted to take you through that because that's the entire piece, and it's then just going to be repeated a number of times but embellished and decorated. And each of the variations that follow are going to have one very distinctive feature that's sort of their calling card, if you like. So the first one is a chromatic embellishment of the main tune. And that's going to take us all the way through. The next one is rapid triplets in the left hand and trills in the right hand. The third one, and this is a common device in a theme variations, you would always have one variation in the opposite tonality to the theme. So if the theme has been in the minor, you must have a variation in the major, and if you've had a theme in the major, like here, you take a theme in the minor, and the mood changes considerably. Becomes much more plaintive. The next variation is back to buoyancy, and he's deploying one of the real physical, technical trends of the time with some hand crossing. Which has a lovely visual effect as well as oral effect, making it feel as if the pianist has 3 hands rather than 2. The next variation, and again this is very typical in the form, is a slow variation. And this is, I think, it's something we'll come on to in a second, but there is no real slow movement to the sonata as a whole. And so in many ways this extended slow variation is, for me, the emotional centre and the soul of the work. And I'm going to save that for you to hear it fresh. The last variation feels completely different. He actually changes the marking and is now marked fast. He also changes the time signature. So you'll have heard at the beginning that we had a lilting time signature. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now we're in 2s. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And so it's got a much more feeling of march-like solidity rather than horizontal rocking. And that brings us along to a riotous, fun conclusion. The second movement would normally be in a different key to the first movement, but that's not the case here. It's also in A major. I can only think that maybe he thought there was so much variety already present in this work that that was a device he didn't really require. But it's a very unusual feeling, I think, for those of us who've heard a lot of sonatas, to finish the first movement and then plough on in exactly the same key. Unbelievable sense of almost through composition and continuality? Maybe continuousness. This is a minuet and trio. Minuet, an elegant, stately dance of the time. So I think the lilting effect from the first movement feeds in here as well, because we're also in 3 time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. very, very elegant and charming. What I like about the trio section, so that's the contrasting central section from the minuet, is that he steals, but in a way to unify, the variation from the first movement with the hand crossing. And the comparison is remarkable, because the writing in thirds is just like he did there as well. And so here we have more thirds, and more hand crossing. Has a lovely effect of tying the two together. And then, as is traditional, after the trio, we hear the minuet one more time, and that's the end of the movement. The last movement is the one that's become the most celebrated of this whole sonata, and I think one that most pianists at some point or another, student or professional, have played or attempted. This is the rondo alla Turca, rondo in the style of Turkish. Well, it then became as sort of marcia alla Turca, or became known as that, so march in the Turkish style. This is not a complete outlier. Turkish music and Turkish culture was very much in vogue at the time in Vienna, and had found its way not just into music, but into other forms of art as well. In music, its device, or the way in which it was manifested, was by drawing on the janissary bands of Turkish music. And so Mozart, you can hear him using rolling drums and clashing cymbals, most specifically in the central section. You can hear this left hand. And then at the very end, everything starts jangling and crashing. The right hand gets involved. And it really takes on this kind of superbly festive, celebratory air. I think what's fun about the last movement is it's a rondo. Normally in a rondo you would expect the main theme to be repeated many times, to come around like rondo many times. Actually, it only happens twice here, and it's almost as if the main theme gets trumped, it's almost a dirty word, trumped, I think, at the moment, gets gesampt, gets beaten, gets won over by the second theme, the more Turkish theme. And that actually comes 3 times versus the main themes 2 times. But this whole movement just brings off a wonderful conclusion to the sonata. This sonata represents a real step down memory lane for me. I last touched this 20 years ago, I think, roughly. But the first movement was on the grade 8 syllabus. And how I remember almost sitting exactly here, probably sitting more like exactly where the camera is now, but on... can't remember if we had this piano yet, even. In fact, in which case maybe I wasn't even in this room. Yeah, my parents got me this piano after I got my grade 8, so it's possibly we didn't have it yet. So it turns out I don't remember very much of the episode at all, except that I know it happened. But yeah, so it's been very, very bizarre to revisit a piece that sort of awakens things right back in the back of your mind that you can't put your finger on. And it feels like a little bit of a completion of a journey that started a long time ago, in the sense of I definitely didn't play it anywhere near the way that I would have wanted to all the way back then. And I think my attempts at the second and third movements were cursory at best. This is for David and Laura. Lovely recommendation from them. And they were 2 of the people who really gave me some of my first opportunities professionally when I was still a teenager. And I'm obviously intensely grateful to you both for that, and intensely thrilled and honoured and chuffed to still be able to connect with you and your wonderful orchestra and make music with them. So thank you for the recommendation, thank you for the request, and send you both lots of love. Hope you enjoy Mozart's A Major Sonata K.331. funny work. Well, I mean, a wonderful work, but a funny work in the feelings that it brings back inside me. I've always thought that for students, and I suppose in many regards we're always students of the piano, the hardest music to play is the music that is without tension, is without pain, is without aggression, is without anger, because so much of what comes naturally when we're trying to do something very difficult coordination wise is tension, and so it's when one is learning, I remember very clearly how much easier it is to play music that is very stormy, because you can throw your tension into the music and it kind of works. The hardest music to play is the music that, like all music of any level, is difficult to play coordination wise, but is utterly without a care in the world, just to be tossed off with ease and élan. And so I view music like that Mozart, and he's often the guy when it comes to that kind of music that needs to sound incredibly carefree, easy, light, but is obviously as difficult as anything else ever written. And I think it's the journey of most of us as musicians to transition from a phase when we're trying very hard to do the right thing to a phase where we're able to trust that the right thing will happen if we relax and if we try and get in the right headspace, the right positive headspace. So it's just been really interesting this last week revisiting that piece, to the point where, I mean, when I was 13 I had very big postural problems that in the long term led to a lot of pain, especially here, and have even left me with some strange goings on in my shoulders. I don't get pain anymore, ever, except when I restarted this piece at the beginning of this week. It was like I was 13 years old again, and suddenly these old pains started appearing back in my shoulders, which was just pretty powerful, I guess, in terms of what it teaches us about what the body stores in its subconscious, and the idea that you could even have a muscular subconscious is pretty cool. But anyway, we're going to finish today with, I think, a piece that's right up there with the Alla Turca as best loved piano classic, Debussy's first Arabesque. Like the Fauré, this is composed right at the beginning of his output. The Fauré, those three pieces were his first compositions for piano. This is not quite so clear cut, but it's certainly the first compositions for piano as a remotely mature composer. He's not deep into impressionistic vein next week. He's not deep into impressionistic vein yet. Next week we will hear him in more of his impressionistic vibe. So Debussy at this point is still much more entrenched in kind of more normal romantic sensibilities. But you can hear by his use of harmony and colour, and I mean it's just the most beautiful sound world that he creates, just the kinds of special sounds that he's hearing in his head and that he's exploring how to get out onto the piano. This is for Mark and Anton, for whom the Fauré was also for. Well, this is for all of you, obviously, but Mark and Anton requested the Fauré and the Debussy, and it's been lovely to get those suggestions from you. I think about you a lot, and it's lovely to feel your spirit when playing the pieces that you've requested. We still will never forget what you did for us a few years ago, and we're now sitting in the house that we were able to complete with a lot less pain thanks to your friendship, love and generosity. We miss our gin and tonic sessions very much, and we hope to reignite them just as soon as possible. Huge love to you both, and here's Debussy's Arabesque. music, good for the soul. Very, very healing stuff, I think. So that's it. The ominous week 13, episode 13, comes to an end with the least ominous of music. And I thank you once more for tuning in. Next week is going to be the last one, not ever, of this current format. The NHS fundraiser draws to a close in about 10 days. So again, if you are enjoying what I'm doing every week, please give what you can to that. We are mere few £100 away from our target. It would be incredible if we could get there. And after next week, we will shift gear and continue to bring you an upgraded, enhanced version of these concerts, which I hope will continue to feed your souls, hearts and minds. I certainly can't imagine stopping sharing these bits of myself and others' wonderful music with you. And so the question is, how can we make it even better? And we'll be bringing more news of that to you very soon. So do continue to donate to the NHS. There's a link to buy my DVD, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.